The rooster's crow had not yet sounded when Thomas the baker pushed aside the woolen blanket that covered the opening to his bedchamber and stepped down into the darkness of his shop, his bare feet finding the familiar worn stones of the floor by memory, alone, the air still holding the warmth of yesterday as baking mixed with the cool dampness of the autumn night that seeped through the shuttered windows and under the heavy oak door that separated his small domain from the village street beyond. He moved through the blackness with the confidence of a man who had performed these same movements every morning for 30 years, since he was 10 years old, and his father had first woken him in the darkness to learn the baker's craft, the ancient art of transforming grain into the bread that sustained life, the fundamental skill that made him not wealthy but essential, not powerful but necessary, not noble but respected. For in the village of Woodhill, in this year of our Lord 1384, in the reign of King Richard II, in a corner of England, where the great events of kingdom and church seemed distant as the stars, Thomas the baker's daily labor meant the difference between a village that ate and a village that starved, between children who grew strong and children who withered, between a community that could work its fields and tend its animals and fulfill its obligations to the Lord, and a community that would fail and scatter and cease to exist. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Thomas struck his flint against steel in the practiced motion that had become as automatic as breathing. The sparks falling into the nest of dry tinder he kept ready on the shelf beside the great stone oven that dominated the back wall of his shop, the tiny flames catching and growing as he fed them carefully with progressively larger pieces of kindling until he had a fire substantial enough to transfer to the oven's mouth. The oven itself was a marvel of medieval engineering, though Thomas would not have thought of it in those terms, being as familiar with it as with his own hands. Built of stone and clay and brick, its domed interior could hold the heat of a wood fire for hours after the flames had been raked out, baking bread in the residual warmth with an efficiency that would not be improved upon for centuries. Thomas's father had built this oven 40 years ago when he established his bakery in Woodhill, and Thomas maintained it with the care one would give to a living thing for his livelihood, and his family's survival depended on its continued function. The fire building was just the beginning of a process that would occupy Thomas until well after the sun had climbed to its zenith. While the oven heated, he turned to the dough that he had mixed the previous evening and left to rise overnight in the great wooden troughs that stood against the wall. The dough had risen as he slept, the mysterious process that medieval bakers observed but could not explain, transforming the dense mixture of flour and water and leaven into something light and airy, full of bubbles, and alive with a yeasty smell that was his signature scent of the bakery. Thomas had learned from his father the proportions and the timings, the feel of dough that was properly mixed, and the look of dough that had risen to exactly the right point. The thousand small judgments that separated good bread from bad edible bread, from spoiled bread that would sustain from bread that would sicken. He worked the dough now in the dim light of the fire, his strong arms kneading and shaping, dividing the mass into loaves of the sizes and shapes that his customers expected and that tradition dictated. The largest loaves round and substantial, would go to the manor house where the Lord and his household consumed bread in quantities that sometimes made Thomas shake his head and wonder. A single day's baking for the manor required more flour than a peasant family might use in a week. The medium loaves, still substantial but smaller, would be for the more prosperous villagers, the freemen who owned their own land and the craftsmen whose skills earned them incomes above mere subsistence. And the small loaves, dense and dark, made with coarser flour and less refined ingredients, would be for the cotters and laborers, the poorest members of the village community who could barely afford even this cheapest bread, but who needed it desperately for survival. As Thomas shaped the loaves and set them aside for their final rising before baking, the first gray light of dawn began to show around the edges of the shutters, and he heard the sounds of the village beginning to wake around him, the lowing of cattle being driven to pasture, the splash of water as someone drew from the village well, the creak of doors opening, and the murmur of voices as his neighbors began their own daily labors. The village of Wood Hill was not large as medieval settlements went, perhaps 300 souls in total, counting every man, woman, and child, clustered around the common green with its ancient oak tree, the church with its square tower, the manor house on the slight rise at the village's edge, and the various cottages and workshops and barns that housed the agricultural community that worked the surrounding fields and answered to the Lord who held these lands from the king. Thomas's bakery occupied a position of importance on the village street, next to the blacksmith's forge and corba, across from the alehouse, positioned so that customers could easily find him, and so that the dangerous heat of his oven was somewhat isolated from the thatched cottages that housed most of the villagers. Fire was a constant terror in medieval villages, where buildings were made of wood and thatch, and where single spark could destroy an entire community in hours. Thomas was scrupulously careful with his flames, banking his fires at night, keeping water barrels always filled and ready, maintaining clear space around his oven, but still the risk was always present, a weight of responsibility that added to the many others he carried. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, Thomas had his first batch of loaves in the oven, the shaped dough having risen to perfection and being ready for the transformation that heat would work upon it. He slid the loaves onto the oven's floor using the long wooden peel, a paddle-like tool that allowed him to place each loaf precisely without burning his hands in the oven's fierce heat. The door of the oven, a heavy wooden and clay construction, was sealed shut to hold in the heat, and now there was nothing to do but wait while the bread baked, the time measured not by clocks, which Thomas had never seen and would not have been able to read, but by experience and by the smell that would tell him when the bread was ready. While the first batch baked, Thomas turned his attention to other tasks. His wife Joan emerged from the family's sleeping quarters, a small room behind the shop that also served as kitchen and general living space for Thomas, Joan, and their 4 surviving children, 2 boys and 2 girls, ranging in age from 13 down to 4. Joan was a sturdy woman of 35, worn by childbearing and hard work, but still strong and capable, essential to the operation of the bakery in ways that outsiders might not recognize, but that Thomas understood perfectly. She brought him a cup of small beer, the weak ale that everyone drank in preference to water that might be contaminated, and a piece of yesterday's bread with a scraping of butter, his breakfast taken standing as he worked. Joan began her own work, sweeping the shop floor, filling the water buckets, preparing the board where Thomas would place the finished loaves for display and sale. Their eldest daughter, Agnes joined her mother in these tasks, learning the skills she would need when she married and established her own household. Their eldest son, John, came to help his father, for at 13 he was old enough to begin learning the baker's craft in earnest, though he had been helping in small ways since he was barely able to walk. The two younger children, Mary and little Thomas, stayed in the family's quarters under the supervision of their grandmother, Joan's mother, who lived with them and helped with the endless domestic tasks that kept a medieval household functioning. As the morning progressed and the shop began to fill with the incomparable smell of baking bread, the first customers arrived. Medieval villages rose early, for the working day was governed by daylight, and the short autumn days left little time for the labor that the agricultural calendar demanded. The bakery's customers came in a steady stream through the morning hours, each purchasing according to their means and their needs, each transaction a small social interaction as well as a commercial exchange. For in a village the size of Woodhill, everyone knew everyone else knew their families, and their circumstances and their histories, and commerce was embedded in a web of personal relationships that governed all aspects of village life. Old widow Marjorie, who lived in a one-room cottage at the edge of the village, and who survived on the charity of her family, and the village community, came with her 2 pennies to buy the smallest loaf, the dark, heavy bread that was all she could afford, and that would constitute the bulk of her diet for the next several days. Thomas handed her the loaf with a greeting and a kind word, and he made sure the loaf was one of the better ones from the batch of small loaves, a small gesture that cost him nothing, but that meant much to the old woman who had so little. The village cared for its poor not through any formal system of welfare, but through such small kindnesses, through the network of family and community obligations that ensured most of the time that no one actually starved even when times were hard. John the carpenter came for 3 medium loaves, paying with a combination of coins and a promise to repair the bakery's door, which had developed a troublesome squeak. Such barter transactions were common in a village economy that was only partly monetized, where most people had more labor and goods to trade than they had actual coins. Thomas accepted the arrangement readily, for he needed the door repaired, and he trusted John to do the work well, and the bread he was providing now would be balanced by the carpentry service, later the debt recorded in memory rather than in writing, for neither man could read or write, and written. Contracts were for important transactions involving the Lord Steward or the church, not for everyday village commerce. The bailiff from the manor house arrived with a servant to collect the bread for the Lord's household, a substantial order that constituted a significant portion of Thomas's daily production. The manor's bread was made from the finest flour, white wheat flour that had been bolted through cloth to remove the bran and produce the refined product that the nobility preferred. Thomas had mixed this dough separately from the coarser bread for the village using flour that the manor had provided from its own stocks, for the Lord was particular about the quality of his bread and would accept nothing less than the best. The bailiff inspected the loaves, counting them carefully and checking their weight against the standard that the manor maintained, for short weighting was a serious offense that could result in fines or worse. Thomas's bread passed the inspection as it always did, for he was scrupulous in his weights and measures, knowing that his reputation and his livelihood depended on honest dealing. As the morning wore on, the bakery became a social center, a gathering place where villagers met and talked as they waited for their bread. The news and gossip of the village circulated here as it did at the church door after Mass, and at the alehouse in the evenings. Thomas heard about the dispute between two of the villains over the boundary between their strips in the open field, about the illness that had struck the smith's wife, about the upcoming marriage between a girl from Wood Hill and a young man from the next village, about the rumor that the Lord might be called to provide soldiers for the king as campaigns in France, though this seemed remote and unlikely to most of the villagers, whose concerns were far more immediate and local. Thomas contributed to these conversations while continuing his work, for a baker's labor was never truly done, even when there were moments of less intense activity. As each batch of loaves finished baking, he removed them from the oven, using his long peel, the bread emerging golden brown and crusty, the smell so enticing that it seemed to draw customers even from the far ends of the village. He tapped each loaf on its bottom, listening for the hollow sound that indicated proper baking, and he set the finished loaves on the display board to cool, while the next batch went into the oven, the rhythm of baking and cooling and selling continuing through the morning and into the early afternoon. By midday the bulk of the baking was complete, and the shop's inventory of fresh bread was at its peak. Thomas ate his own midday meal, bread and pottage brought from the family's pot, where Joan had been cooking a thick vegetable soup that would feed the family for this meal and probably for supper as well. The pottage contained leeks and cabbage from their small garden peas, from the dried stores they had laid up after harvest, a bit of bacon for flavoring, all simmered together into a nutritious if monotonous dish that was a staple of peasant diet. Thomas ate with his family in the small room behind the shop, taking a brief rest before the afternoon's work, for though the baking was mostly done, there was still much to do. The afternoon brought different tasks and different rhythms. With the day's baking complete, Thomas could turn his attention to preparation for tomorrow's bread. The grain that would become flour, the flour that would become dough, the dough that would become bread. This chain of transformation began with the grain that Thomas purchased from the villains who grew it or received as payment from customers who had more grain than cash. The grain was stored in large sacks in a dry room at the back of the bakery, protected from moisture and vermin as much as medieval storage methods allowed, though losses to rats and mice were inevitable and had to be factored into the economics of the bakery. Today's task was to take grain to the mill to be ground into flour, a job that Thomas assigned to his son John, sending the boy with 2 sacks loaded onto their small handcart for the walk to the water mill that stood on the stream at the edge of the village. The mill was a monopoly of the Lord, who required all his tenants to use his mill and to pay the customary fees for grinding, a source of income for the manor and a source of resentment for the villains, who saw it as yet another exaction from a lord who seemed to take much and give little in return. But the mill was also a necessity, for grinding grain by hand with querns was back-breaking labor that few households could sustain, for all their grain needs, and the water-powered mill could grind in a day what would take a person weeks by hand. John set off with the cart, and Thomas returned to the shop, where a few late customers were still arriving, though the pace of business had slowed considerably from the morning rush. A traveling merchant passing through the village stopped to purchase bread for his journey, paying in silver pennies that Thomas accepted with pleasure, for coin was always more useful than barter when it came time to pay his own debts and purchase the things his family needed but could not produce. The merchant brought news from the wider world, tales of events in London and of ships from across the sea bringing exotic goods. Stories that seemed fantastical to Thomas, whose world rarely extended beyond a few miles from Woodhill, but that reminded him that the village was part of a larger realm and a larger Christendom. As the afternoon progressed, Thomas turned to maintenance and preparation tasks. The oven needed to be cleaned of ash and inspected for any cracks or damage that might need repair. The tools of the trade, peels and dough troughs, mixing bowls, and measuring cups needed to be cleaned and checked and maintained. The shop itself needed to be swept and organized, the flour dust that coated every surface wiped away, the mice that inevitably invaded any place where grain was stored, trapped, and removed. These tasks were less skilled than the actual baking, but no less necessary. The unglamorous maintenance work that kept the bakery functioning day after day, year after year. Joan worked alongside her husband in these tasks, for the bakery was truly a family enterprise, even though Thomas's name was the one associated with it. She managed the household finances, keeping in her head the complex web of debts and credits, of customers who owed money and suppliers who needed to be paid, of grain purchased and flour produced and bread sold. She could not read or write any more than Thomas could, but she had a sharp mind for numbers, and she rarely made mistakes in her reckonings. When disputes arose about what was owed or what had been paid, it was Joan's memory that settled them, her word being trusted as much as any written record might have been. The late afternoon brought another round of customers, villagers returning from the fields who stopped to purchase bread for their evening meals. These later sales were smaller than the morning's business, but they were steady and reliable, and Thomas welcomed every transaction. A baker's profit margin was small in the best of times. The difference between the cost of grain and labor and fuel and all the other expenses of the bakery and the price that customers could afford to pay for bread, being measured in pennies and half-pennies, not in shillings or pounds. Thomas and his family lived comfortably by village standards. They were never hungry. They had adequate clothing. Their cottage was solid and weather-tight, but they were not wealthy and could never be wealthy, for the nature of their trade limited what they could charge, and the size of their market limited how much they could sell. John returned from the mill in late afternoon with the freshly ground flour, a slightly smaller quantity than the grain he had taken, because the miller had taken his toll, the customary portion of the grain that was his payment for grinding. Thomas inspected the flour, checking its texture and color, running it through his fingers to feel for any excessive grit or other signs that the millstones needed to be dressed. The flour was acceptable, as it usually was, though not exceptional, and Thomas calculated how much bread it would yield and allocated it mentally to tomorrow's baking, the white flour for the manor's bread, the darker, coarser flour for the village's various grades of loaves. As evening approached and the sun declined toward the western horizon, the bakery's work-day drew to a close. Thomas mixed the dough for tomorrow's baking, combining flour and water and the leaven that he maintained from batch to batch, a fermented mixture of flour and water that contained the wild yeasts that would make the bread rise. Medieval bakers did not understand the biology of fermentation, did not know that microscopic organisms were responsible for the transformation of dense dough into light bread, but they understood the practice perfectly, maintaining their leavens with careful attention, feeding them regularly, protecting them from temperature extremes, treating them almost as living things that needed care, which in a sense they were. The dough mixed and set aside to rise overnight, Thomas could finally rest. The shop was closed and shuttered. the day's earnings counted and stored, the tools cleaned and ready for tomorrow. The family gathered for supper around the small table in their living quarters, the pottage from midday reheated and supplemented with bread and cheese and a bit of dried fish, a meal that was simple but adequate, consumed with the deep satisfaction that came from a day's hard work completed. The children chattered about their day's activities and observations, the girls helping their mother with domestic tasks and caring for their grandmother, the boys working with their father or running errands around the village, little Thomas playing but also beginning to learn the 1,000 small lessons that would shape him into a productive member of the medieval community. After supper there was a brief period of leisure before bed. Though leisure in a medieval village was not what modern people would recognize by that term, there was no reading, for books were rare and expensive, and the family was illiterate anyway. There were no entertainments beyond those the family created for themselves. Joan spun wool into thread by the light of a tallow candle, the distaff in one hand and the spindle in the other, the rhythmic motion of twisting fiber into yarn being so practiced that she could do it while talking or thinking about other things. Thomas worked on a small carpentry project, repairing a stool that had broken, his hands busy but his mind at rest. The children played simple games or listened to their grandmother tell stories the oral tradition of folk tales and legends and family history that was the primary form of entertainment, an education for medieval children who would never learn to read. The family's day ended, as it had begun, in darkness, for candles and tallow lamps were expensive and were used sparingly. Evening prayers were said, the familiar words that connected this humble family to the vast structure of the medieval church, reminding them of their place in God's creation and of their duties to Him and to each other. And then to bed, Thomas and Joan and the younger children in the one bed that the family possessed, the older children on pallets on the floor, the grandmother in her small corner with her own modest bedding. The house was cold, for the fire was banked for the night to conserve fuel, and the family huddled together under woolen blankets, and whatever other coverings they had their bodies, providing warmth for each other in the chill of the autumn night. Thomas's last thoughts before sleep claimed him were of tomorrow's baking, of the dough rising in its troughs, of the oven that would need to be heated, of the customers who would come expecting bread. The worry that some disaster might befall his business, fire or theft or illness, or any of the countless calamities that could destroy a baker-s. Livelihood was always present in the back of his mind, but it was balanced by the confidence that came from 30 years of successful practice, from the knowledge that he was skilled at his craft, and that as long as people needed bread and he could bake it, his family would survive. It was a modest ambition by the standards of nobles or wealthy merchants, but it was realistic and achievable, and in the uncertain world of the 14th century, that was no small thing. The pattern of Thomas's days varied little from one to the next, for the rhythm of the bakery was dictated by the unchanging need for bread and by the routines that experience had proven most efficient. Each day brought the same sequence of tasks, rising in darkness, kindling the fire, preparing the dough, shaping the loaves, baking, selling, cleaning, preparing for tomorrow. The cycle repeated with small variations across the weeks and months, following the larger cycle of the agricultural year, as harvest brought abundant grain and high production, while spring sometimes meant short supplies and careful rationing of expensive flour. But within this repetitive pattern there was also variety and incident, the small dramas and events that gave texture to village life, There were feast days and holy days when the bakery was closed, and the family attended Mass and joined in the communal celebrations that marked the church, calendar Easter and Christmas and Pentecost, and the feast days of various saints, each with their own traditions and observances. There were market days when Thomas would sometimes make the journey to the nearest town to sell surplus bread or to purchase supplies that the village could not provide. There were births and deaths and marriages, the great transitions of human life that the village marked with ceremonies and feasts and mourning. Thomas attended these events as a respected member of the community, for bakers occupied an important position in the village hierarchy, not as high as the priest or the Lord's bailiff, certainly not as high as the few freemen who owned substantial land, but above the laborers and cotters, and well above the landless poor. Thomas was called upon to witness agreements, to serve on the manorial court that judged disputes and enforced the customs of the village, to contribute to the various communal expenses that the village incurred. He took these responsibilities seriously, understanding that his status in the community brought obligations as well as respect. The turning of the seasons brought different challenges and different rhythms to the bakery. Winter was difficult, with fuel expensive and customers sometimes unable to pay because their own stores were running low. Spring was a time of shortage, the old year's harvest being depleted, and the new harvest still months away, prices for grain rising, and Thomas having to raise his prices correspondingly, though not too much, or he would lose customers who could barely afford bread, even at normal prices. Summer was better, with abundant grain from the new harvest, and customers having more money from their labor in the fields. Autumn was the peak season, with the harvest providing ample grain, and with the cooling weather making the hot work of baking less oppressive. Through all these seasons, Thomas maintained his routines and upheld his standards, baking bread that was honest in weight and wholesome in quality, dealing fairly with his customers, paying his debts, attending to his religious obligations, raising his children to be productive members of the community. He was not a hero or a villain, not a saint or a sinner beyond the ordinary measure, not exceptional in any way that the world would notice or remember. He was simply a baker in a small English village in the late 14th century, living the life that his birth and his training had prepared him for, fulfilling the role that medieval society had assigned to him. But in living that ordinary life, in baking that daily bread, Thomas was performing a service that was fundamental to the existence of his community. The bread he produced was not a luxury, but a necessity, the staff of life that medieval people depended on for the majority of their calories. Without bread, the village could not function. Without bakers, there would be no bread, at least not in the quantities and the quality that a settled agricultural community required. And so Thomas's daily labor, repetitive and unglamorous though it was essential, and he took quiet pride in doing it well. The years passed, and Thomas grew older, his dark hair graying, his strong arms becoming slightly less strong, his back sometimes aching from the decades of bending and lifting and standing at the oven. His children grew and began to follow their own paths, John learning the baker's trade with the intention of taking over the bakery eventually. Agnes married to a young man from a neighboring village, Mary helping her mother, and beginning to attract the attention of potential suitors. Little Thomas, still a child, but already showing interest in his father's work. Joan aged alongside her husband, her face becoming more lined, her hands becoming more gnarled from the endless labor of a medieval housewife, but her spirit remaining strong and her mind remaining sharp. The village around them also changed, though more slowly, the generations succeeding each other in the cottages and the fields. Some families rising in prosperity and status, while others declined, the fortunes of agriculture rising and falling with the weather and the harvest. The lord who held the manor changed when the old lord died, and his son inherited, bringing different policies and different demands, but not fundamentally altering the structure of village life. The priest who served the church retired and was replaced by a younger man trained at a distant monastery, whose ideas about proper religious observance sometimes clashed with the traditional practices of the village, but who was eventually absorbed into the community as his predecessor had been. Through all these changes, the bakery remained a constant. Thomas rising each morning in the darkness to kindle his fire and bake his bread, the smell of baking filling the village street, the customers coming in their endless stream to purchase the daily bread that sustained them. It was a pattern that had existed for generations before Thomas, and that would continue for generations after him. For as long as people ate bread, and as long as bread needed to be baked, there would be bakers performing the ancient craft, transforming grain into the fundamental food of civilization. As Thomas entered his 50s and then his 60s, he gradually began to transfer more of the bakery's work to his son John, teaching the young man the subtle skills and accumulated wisdom of a lifetime of baking. John learned not just the mechanical tasks, but the judgment and the knowledge that separated a merely competent baker from an excellent one, how to assess the quality of grain, how to adjust proportions based on the weather and the flour's moisture content, how to time the baking perfectly, how to deal with customers fairly while still protecting the bakery's interests, how to maintain the oven and the tools and all the complex infrastructure of the business. This transfer of knowledge and responsibility was not a single event, but a gradual process that took years, the son slowly, assuming more of the father's role, while the father remained available for advice and assistance and final decisions. It was the way that craft knowledge was transmitted in medieval society, through this apprenticeship of family members or of young people formally bound to master craftsmen, the skills passing from one generation to the next in an unbroken chain that stretched back to the beginning of the craft and that would, everyone assumed, stretch forward indefinitely into the future. And so the cycle continued, the daily bread being baked each morning, the villagers being fed the great wheel of the seasons turning birth and death and marriage and harvest and planting, and all the rhythms of medieval life repeating in their endless patterns. Thomas's story was not unique or particularly remarkable by medieval standards. It was the common story of countless craftsmen and laborers and peasants whose lives were shaped by the requirements of their work and by the structures of the society into which they were born. They did not achieve fame or fortune. They did not change the world or leave their mark on history in any way that would be remembered centuries later. They simply lived and worked and raised their families and died, their existence leaving no more permanent trace than the bread they baked, consumed, and forgotten within days of its creation. But in another sense, their lives mattered profoundly, for the daily labor of people like Thomas was what made medieval society possible. The great cathedrals and castles, the political dramas of kings and nobles, the intellectual achievements of universities and monasteries, all of these rested on the foundation of the agricultural and craft economy that people like Thomas sustained through their daily work. The bread that the baker produced fed the laborers who built the cathedrals, fed the soldiers who garrisoned the castles, fed the scholars who studied in the universities, fed the monks who copied manuscripts in the monasteries. Without this foundation of ordinary labor producing the necessities of life, none of the more exalted achievements of medieval civilization would have been possible. As Thomas sat in his bakery on a late autumn afternoon in what would turn out to be the final year of his life, resting after a morning of baking and watching the customers come and go, he was not thinking about his place in the grand sweep of history, or about the importance of his labor to the maintenance of civilization. He was thinking about simpler things, about whether the grain supply would hold out through the winter, about his daughter, Mary's upcoming marriage, and the portion he would need to provide for her, about the pain in his back that was becoming more troublesome with each passing year, about whether John was truly ready to take over full responsibility for the bakery. These were the concerns that filled his mind, the immediate and practical matters that constituted his lived experience. The sun was declining toward evening when Thomas rose from his stool and began the familiar round of closing up the shop for the day. The shutters were secured, the tools were cleaned and stored, the day-as earnings were counted and wrapped in a cloth and hidden in the small iron-bound chest where the family kept their modest savings. The oven, which had been cooling since the last batch of bread was removed at midday, was checked one final time to ensure no embers remained that might spark a fire during the night. The shop was swept clean, the mice traps were set, the door was barred from the inside. And then Thomas stepped through into the family's quarters, where Joan was preparing the evening meal, and where the familiar rhythms of family life awaited him. As night fell over the village of Wood Hill and Thomas settled into sleep beside his wife, the dough he had mixed in the evening rose slowly in its troughs in the darkened shop, preparing itself for tomorrow's transformation into bread. Outside, the village slept beneath a clear autumn sky, the cottages dark, the streets empty, the fields lying quiet under the stars. The great stone church stood watch over the community, its tower rising above the thatched roofs, its bells silent until dawn would bring the call to morning prayers. In the manor house on the hill, the lord and his household also slept, protected by their walls and their privilege. And in the forest beyond the village, the deer and the boar and all the wild creatures pursued their own nocturnal business, indifferent to the human settlement nearby. In the morning the cycle would begin again, as it had begun every morning for as long as anyone could remember, and as it would continue for as long as the village existed. Thomas would wake in the darkness, and kindle his fire, and shape his loaves, and bake his bread. The villagers would rise and go about their work in the fields and the workshops and the cottages. The sun would trace its arc across the sky, marking the hours that governed the medieval day, and the bread that Thomas baked would sustain them all, providing the energy and the nourishment that made their labor possible, fulfilling the fundamental human need that had been met by bakers since the first person discovered that grain could be ground and mixed with water and transformed by fire into something greater than the sum of its parts. This was Thomas the baker's life, simple, repetitive, ordinary, and absolutely essential. It was a life lived close to the margins, where a bad harvest or a serious illness or a fire in the bakery could mean disaster. But it was also a life with dignity and purpose, a life that contributed meaningfully to the community, a life that was valued and respected by neighbors who understood the importance of what the baker did. It was not an easy life by modern standards. The work was hard, the hours were long, the uncertainties were many. But it was a life that Thomas had found satisfying, a life that had provided for his family and had earned him a respected place in the village community. And when Thomas died, which he did peacefully in his bed on a winter night in 1401, mourned by his family and missed by his neighbors, his son John took over the bakery and continued the tradition, making the daily bread that the village required, maintaining the oven that his grandfather had built, serving the community as his father had served it. The cycle continued, the bread was baked, the village endured, and Thomas's life, ordinary though it had been, had fulfilled its purpose and had left the world a slightly better place than he had found it, which is perhaps all that any life can really claim to have accomplished. The story of Thomas the Baker is the story of medieval life at its most fundamental level, not the grand events of politics and war, not the intellectual achievements of the learned, not the artistic masterpieces of the talented, but the daily labor of ordinary people doing ordinary work, sustaining their families and their communities through skill and dedication and simple persistence. It is a story that could be told about thousands of villages and tens of thousands of individuals across medieval Europe, each with their own details and particulars, but all sharing the common pattern of lives shaped by the requirements of survival in an agricultural society, by the rhythms of the seasons and the turning of the generations, by the need for daily bread and the labor required to produce it. In the quiet darkness of the medieval night, in the cottage that had been home to 3 generations of bakers, the dough rose in its troughs and waited for the morning, when the fire would be kindled and the oven would be heated and the transformation would begin again, grain becoming flour, flour becoming dough, dough becoming bread, bread sustaining life, life continuing through another day, another season, another year, the great wheel turning endlessly, the baker's craft continuing, the daily bread being baked, the village enduring, the pattern repeating, the story being lived and relived by generations who knew their place and did their work and found their satisfaction not in changing the world, but in maintaining it, not in grand achievement, but in competent fulfillment of humble but essential tasks, not in fame or fortune, but in the quiet respect of neighbors and the simple satisfaction of a job well done, day after day, year after year, life after life, through the long centuries of the medieval age and beyond, the baker's daily bread sustaining them all,